Grief doesn't always have to be the loss of a loved one, right? It could also be the loss of a job or a dream or a relationship. I think a lot of men, even today, we're pretty much brainwashed, to believe that, real men don't cry, or share emotions or seek therapy, and that's just not true. If you've experienced a traumatic event, especially the loss of a child, you can't outrun that. You can't outsmart it. You can't outflank it. I'm not saying not to think about it. I'm just saying don't live there, because it is a choice. Where focus goes, energy flows. Out of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? So you want to know what's in somebody's heart, just listen to them speak. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean that because we choose to go on and get on with our life, doesn't mean that we're forgetting about that person that we lost. Just, make sure that you're not going through it alone is definitely one of the big things. And making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well.
Well, welcome everyone to the Revolutionary Man podcast. I'm the founder of The Awakened Man and your host, Alan DeMonso. Not a moment goes by where I don't think about my father-in-law or my father, even though they've been gone for several years now. And I still have moments of pain and sorrow. Because you see, grief is something that each of us will come face to face at some point in our lives. And it is in that journey through grief that we discover a lot about ourselves, everything from feelings of loneliness, being stuck, and then wondering what to do. Well, today my guest is going to share his incredible story and through what he had gone through and help us shine a light on the path to healing as we work through our own personal grief. Before we get into all that, I want to remind you to hit like, share, and subscribe on your favorite platforms. You can stay updated to the latest content while helping me grow the Awakened Man message. And for that, I just want to say I'm truly grateful. So let's get on with today's episode.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
As you know, it's customary. I like to start off by asking a couple of questions to help set the stage for our topic today. So the first one I have for you is, who is the last person that you lost in your life? And how has your grief journey shaped you from that incident? Death is inevitable, and with it comes pain, sorrow, and grief. So I want to get into it right away today and introduce my guest. Phil Cohen is a keynote TEDx speaker, a grief coach, and the creator of the Grief Continuum. It's a framework for helping others grow, flourish, and overcome despair by discovering and developing their inner resilience. Now, for over 25 years, Phil has helped global technology startups grow and prosper through developing their sales teams. But it was through the experience and the sudden loss of his son that Phil found a renewed purpose in helping others to integrate grief into their own lives after experiencing the inevitable traumas, tragedies, and transitions in life. Welcome to the show today. How are you?
Hey, Alan, thank you. Appreciate that. I'm doing great.
Yeah.
I know the topic is a heavy one, but hopefully, there's generally there's at least one or two people out there in the audience suffering from something. And grief doesn't always have to be the loss of a loved one, right? It could also be the loss of a job or a dream or a relationship. So, as we go through our conversation today, hopefully there'll be a couple of tips that, your listeners can pick up.
You betcha. And I really like that you've already started that and made that point, Phil, because I think it is important that grief can come in a lot of different ways. And so I'd like to start off by a lot of the things that we talk about in the Awakened Man movement is we talk about everyone being on their own hero's journey or their hero's quest, as I call it. Yeah. And so while I've given them a bit of a teaser about your quest, I'd like to have you, expand on that and tell us how your journey has shaped and paved you a road for how you are today and the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So, I'm not really sure exactly where to start, but I'll start with the incident with my son. Yeah. Maybe I'll back up a little bit. Born and raised in New York, always been super entrepreneurial. At one point I was living in South Florida and I owned a sign business. I was doing all different types of graphic design, mostly vehicle wraps, boat wraps, things like that. kind of got sick of that. I mean, to anybody that's thinking about starting their own business, I know it's kind of off topic, but after 7 years of doing something, I realized I really don't like the graphic design part.
Mhm.
I don't like the production part, and I don't like the actual application part. It was the starting and growing a business and being entrepreneurial that I really loved. So after 7 years of doing this business, which, I enjoyed the growing the business part, but I was listening to a podcast, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Lee Dumas's Entrepreneur on Fire.
Yeah.
It's it's what was, and this is back in 2015 when nobody really knew what a podcast was. And my whole life, prior to starting that graphic design business is sales. My whole family, we're all salespeople, right? So my brother runs. Are you familiar with Tony Robbins at all?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. The way you said
Who
that
hasn't?
So my brother works for his company. He's run his company for, in terms of product and coaching sales for a really long time.
Nice.
And I called him up. I'm like, bro, we should start a podcast, about sales. I'm like, and I, I'm really like detail oriented. I saw the vision of where I thought podcasting was going, and I was on the right track for sure. And he's just super off the cuff, funny, and just he's been running sales teams, so have I, for a long time. And I'm like, I really think we could do this. And he's like, fine. He's like, come out here to San Diego. He was living in San Diego. I was in Fort Lauderdale at the time. Come out to San Diego. You run everything. I just want to sit down and do the talking. I was like, fine, no problem. So I went out there in late 2014, beginning of 2015. I was there for a couple of months. And then I received a call from my ex-wife. We had been divorced already for probably 8 years. So really the only time when I saw the phone ring with her, it was something to do with my son. So she called, I picked up the phone, and she said something like, Phil, Perry is missing. Perry is my son's name. Perry is missing. The Coast Guard is looking for him. I had to call and let you know. And I'm not going to go into the remainder of that phone call. It was all like, oh, what do you mean he's missing? What happened? That kind of a thing. So long story short, on July 24th of 2015, my 14-year-old son and his close friend were last seen leaving the Jupiter Inlet, which is an inlet that leads out of the Loxahatchee River into the Atlantic Ocean, on a 19-foot fishing boat. There was a really bad storm, one of those South Florida storms. If you've ever been or lived near the coast, near South Florida especially, these storms come out of nowhere. It's like, could go from a beautiful, sunny, perfect day, crazy storm, and then back to sunny within 15 minutes. Wow. So one of these storms came out of nowhere. It was heavy rains, winds of 40 miles an hour. And after several calls to reach the boys on their cell phones unsuccessfully, the Coast Guard was notified, and one of the, if not the largest searches in the history of the United States Coast Guard ensued. They searched for the boys for 7 excruciating days. Wow. Neither of the boys were ever found. And still, even to this day, although I have a pretty good idea that I know what happened, but I don't know for sure. Right. And that was my real entry into the life of what grief was really about. Prior to that, I'd always considered myself really blessed for never having lost anybody, because, really just my grandfather, who I wasn't really that close to. So this was all of a sudden, I hadn't really lost anybody. Then all of a sudden lost the most precious person in my life. So my life was literally cut in two. There'll be the pre-Phil Cohen and now the post-Phil Cohen. So that was the event that occurred, and then the dealing with it after that was a whole set of other circumstances.
Yeah, no kidding. I like that you bring it, that you did start off about talking about your professional life, because part of your message as well is also about, reclaiming and finding purpose again, especially after a traumatic event like that and losing, losing a son or a daughter. Right. And I think that's so key that we remind our listeners that our journey is about having purpose and meaning in our life. And sometimes it takes a tragedy like that for us to get back on path. And I also like about how you talked about, in your intro here about not not having had to deal with a death like this. And because I think back as a young man, I lost my grandparents as well. And while we spent time out on the farm as a young boy, like preteen, there wasn't really that real deep connection, right? It wouldn't be it wasn't the same, and it wouldn't be the same as it would be with a child. And so I think that's also important for us to remember, because folks listening today may not quite grasp that. And so we're tying and stitching a bunch of stuff, job loss, divorce, lots of different ways that we can have a traumatic experience in our life that's going to cause us to go through the grief process. So tell me, how did you deal with grief in the short term? Because it must have been like truly overwhelming for you.
It was extremely overwhelming. Yeah. I mean, I didn't know what to do. Really. I didn't know, like you had mentioned, there's no class that we take in high school. There's no book you can read or preparation course you could take for going through an event like this. Really, in the short term, I was dazed and confused. I had no idea. I would say, on the floor in a dark room, curled up in a ball, just crying, missing my son, feeling feelings of worthlessness, guilt, that I couldn't protect him and that I couldn't save him. And then, but I wasn't really sure. I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to be doing. Thankfully I had friends and family around me that kind of helped lift me up. And sometimes they can also say and do things that, are the wrong thing that people don't realize too until later. Always it's in our nature as humans to not see somebody, when you see somebody you love who's hurting and crying and in pain, you don't want them to stay there, so you try to drag them out of it. But oftentimes, that's part of the healing process, is you've got to go through that pain part of it and to really to face it. I mean, I can say, to skip ahead a little bit, one of the biggest things one of the main reasons that I'm able to stand and talk and go through, talking about podcasts and helping, with a heart to want to help others through this process, is because of the fact that I finally did face it. I stopped running from my pain. I sat in it. I realized, okay, this is what's happened to me. And I went from really stopping asking why me, why did this happen, all the why questions, to all right, well, what can I do about it now, because this is my reality. What steps am I going to take about it in my now? But at first, I actually Googled how to grieve, because I wasn't even sure if I'm even doing this the right way. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't pushing things down, or that something wasn't going to come back and bite me later on in life, that I was somehow. So I did a lot of that. I went to therapy. I saw therapists. I did EMDR therapy. I did everything I thought that I should do to try and get back to, at least some sense of normalcy. So those were the basic steps that I took in the short and medium term.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds, that sounds something that I would do as well, right? Going through, you're grasping, right? You just want to find something, an answer. And the key is that you were taking some action to start to move that process forward. And even though it may not be where you ultimately ended, it started the process of discovery. And I think that's important for us to pick up on. Of course, after a while, the dust is going to settle a little bit for you. So what coping mechanisms did you use to help? You've started your healing process, but what coping mechanisms were you using?
In terms of coping, like I said, I did go to therapy, did some talk therapy, did EMDR therapy, which actually EMDR therapy I did find quite helpful. But none of those things solved, really took away the pain, that deep pain. And I'm not sure that there is really a way you can really remove that pain, I recall when I did my Google search on grieving, the only thing that I could find was the 5 stages of grief. Yeah. And for me, immediately I felt a sense of pressure, like I was doing something wrong, because I didn't experience grief the way that they explain it. And for your listeners who may not know what the 5 stages of grief are, it's a framework that suggests that when you experience grief, you go through specific stages, that you go from denial, oh man, I can't believe I totally forgot. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Yeah.
Those are the 5 stages, and that you move through them somewhat linearly. But in my process, I felt fear. I felt revenge. These are things that are not even, in the 5 stages. So for me, it was like, I don't think that we experience grief in the same way that we experience school, that we all start at the same place, graduate through the same stages to eventually arrive at the same destination. And I think that there's also things past acceptance. There are good things, and once you do reach acceptance, for those people that finally reach a place of acceptance, there are gifts that can be found beyond acceptance. One of those for me was, I feel my true purpose in life to help other people get through a similar process. And that once you reach acceptance, it's not like, all right, I'm good. I'm never have to cry again. It's, I cried this morning in the shower talking to Perry, and that's okay. It's okay that we move back and forth through this grief process. It's just that, some people, I'd say about 10% of the people that I speak with will say something like, Phil, you know what? Listen, I don't care what you got to tell me, what stories you have to tell, what books you have me to read, what process you want me to go through. I lost the most precious person in my life. My life is over. It's done. There's nothing you can, I'm only on this call because my wife made me come to this call, those kinds of things. And it's like, well, in those cases, you're right. If you believe that you can't get past a certain point, then likely you won't. Yes. But there are things that can help people get there faster. And maybe we'll get into some of that as we continue to talk.
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking about the you're talking about the 5 stages and the linear aspect of it, and I think of the vision I have in my mind is it's almost like being in a tornado, and some days are better days than others, and other days it's worse, but ultimately you work your way down to the bottom of that funnel. And you come out, and maybe not totally, because like you said, you're in the shower, you're having a conversation with Perry, and you're emotional again. And how could you not? And how could we not? And I think for guys, I think sometimes we struggle with this linear mindset that we have, and how at some point I should be at the finish line and it's over with. So would you say, is that one of the reasons why men, we tend to want to avoid grief? Or what have you found in your journey with the folks that you work with?
Yeah, especially. It's definitely, I think it's starting to shift just now, so I'm 50. So, I feel like, in my life, I think a lot of men, even today, we're pretty much brainwashed, to believe that, real men don't cry, or share emotions or seek therapy, and that's just not true. Because if you've experienced a traumatic event, especially the loss of a child, you can't outrun that. You can't outsmart it. You can't outflank it. I kind of liken it to trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It's something you can do. It takes a little bit of effort, takes some work, but eventually it's going to find its way to the surface. And the faster and harder you push it down, the harder and faster it's going to come up. And sometimes it hits you right in the face. And it's just something that you really, you need to be prepared for. But yeah, I found that especially men who have lost a child, there's a certain other aspect of it that a lot of people don't think about, is that, I think culturally, as just naturally, everybody wants to flock around mom. And that makes perfect sense to me. I get it. I don't think we should stop doing that. It's just that dad wants to be strong for his wife, strong for his family, and oftentimes doesn't really wind up actually dealing with it. And that's where some of the problems come in. A lot of times they'll just dive right back into work, or they'll, find something else that may be even less productive or less constructive, like drugs or alcohol or, depression, things like that. But really it's in the facing it that's going to be the first step. There's a 3-step process that I walk people through. So it's called ultimately recognize, repair, and react. But the first step is to recognize this is what's happened.
Yeah.
to face it, and then start to take some of the steps in repair. And then once we've taken those steps, we could talk about some things we can actually do about it.
Yeah. Love that. I think that makes so much sense. And that was actually where I was going to go next to, was talking about your, I'm assuming you're leading into your top 3 strategies of how you're working with folks. And so I wanted to get into a little bit more about how that came about and how you used it for yourself as well as other people.
Yeah, it was, in first just coming to the realization that, that again, this is something that occurred. And to recognize that, listen, where focus goes, energy flows. It's just one of the things that I get people to think about, because, although, you could stand outside anywhere underneath the sun and feel like you're being wrapped in a warm blanket. But if we take a magnifying glass and focus its energy, we can start a fire, right? So if you continue to think about all the negative aspects of the thing that happened to you, that's just going to bring about more negative aspects. I'm not saying not to think about it. I'm just saying don't live there, because it is a choice. It is a choice. And the fact is, there are countless stories of men and women who have faced unimaginable horrors, from the death of a loved one to wrongful imprisonment to debilitating illness and worse, yet who've managed to rise from the ashes to greatness. I mean, like diamonds, they were transformed by the immense pressure. And these individuals have found a way to turn weakness into strength. They took what could destroy most of us and used it to propel them to greatness. And I believe that we all have that same power.
Completely agree with you as well, my friend. I think we all have that power, and I like the analogy of the pressure of the diamond, right? And that really comes forward. And so I'm wondering for you, as one of the things that I always say is that, when we get under moments of pressure, it's not so much that it defines our character, but it reveals a character of who we are, like really the true depth, not the surface stuff that we like to pretend and masquerade around and think that let people think that this is who we are, but the real Phil and the real Alan. And so tell me a little bit about that and how that internal process shifted for you, and how you were able to move through that process.
Yeah. So that's like when you get squeezed, you really know what comes out, right? You're going to find, and what's going to come out is all the stuff that you've put in, prior to those events. And for me, I'm a Christian, and, I am so thankful that I had the word in me, and learned some of the basics before this event, because, without my faith, I wouldn't have gotten through this, and so, it just, out of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? So you want to know what's in somebody's heart, just listen to them speak, and you see them get squeezed, and you're going to know what they're all about. And, prior to that, I remember, years before, when I had originally started going to church and got saved, and my friends would come to me, and I would share my faith with my friends, and they would say things like, well, that's great, Phil, but you really believe that people live to be 800 years old, and that someone lived in the belly of a whale for 3 days, and like, you believe that? And I hated that I couldn't answer that with any type of real substantial answers. So that got me studying apologetics, and learning how to defend the faith. And the more that I studied, and the more that I read the Bible, I realized, wow, like there's way too much in this book for it to be coincidence. Like this is much more than just 66 books. I mean, there's the numbers, the dates, the way that things happened. It was just way too much. So I had already convinced myself that there is a God, number one. So when this happened, I know this may sound crazy to your audience, and I'm not saying that this is a strategy that they can take, but I'm not here to sell anything, by the way. So at the end of this, I'm not going to say, here's an offer. I really just want to share my story and hope to inspire people. So on the fifth day of the search, when I was pretty confident that I wasn't going to see my son again, I remember going into a back room and getting on the floor and lying down and starting praying. And in that prayer, I said, okay, God, thank you. Like, I don't know why I'm saying thank you. That may sound crazy to a lot of people, but your word says to be thankful in all things. And I believe that in some way and somehow you're going to make this a good thing. Not that my son being gone could ever be a good thing, but ultimately now the Lord has me sharing my story in ways that I know are helping other people and ultimately glorifying his name.
Yeah.
And that's really the path that I'm on. And I don't even know exactly where I'm going from here, Alan, 100%. I just know that, it's one of those stories where it's like, God will say, go stand on this corner. And when you get there, I'll tell you what you're supposed to do next, and that's kind of what I'm doing now. So, just having just having that type of mentality, even though the pain, it didn't take away the pain, but going into it thinking, okay, like, I have to believe that there's going to be something good that's going to come from this, also helped quite a bit. And then there's the practical steps of, cultivating community, self-care, even just, simply, going outside. Even could be something that's going outside in a place where somebody may not hear you and just screaming, getting it out. Because you cannot hold these types of things in. But my point in all this is that, you can't run from it. You can't. You have to stand and face it. And then, if we had more time, I could talk about some of the hows. But
yeah. I love that, Phil, that you just that you talk about facing it, and then you're absolutely right, because the moment that you were able to give thanks, the burden for you was released, right? Because it moved you to, I'm speaking for you, so you can correct me if I'm off base, but to me, it moved you from victim position to being grateful for seeing the beauty in such a tragic and terrible piece, and how difficult that is for us to finally get there. And I think that is the beauty, because you had faith and you had something to fall back on. And so for those of us, and I would consider myself to be a Christian as well, but for those of us that are listening that may not have that kind of faith behind them to make it through, do you have any recommendations or suggestions for them of how they could move through a process?
Well, like I said, there's going to be, cultivating community, making sure that, that you have the right people around you to help you get through this. You cannot get through this alone. You need somebody to talk to, whether it's a therapist or a close friend, but somebody that you trust, and it has to be, the right kinds of people, because as I said earlier, I had friends that would come over and be like, you know what you need, Phil? You need to come out and have a beer with us. And no, that's not what I needed, and it's often like, oak trees, right? They're often planted near one another in bunches. And as they grow and mature, their root systems become intertwined. And that provides the entire grove of trees with extra strength. So when these storms come, the trees are interconnected below the ground, and they hold sturdy despite the strong winds. Yes. So if one tree is lacking in nutrients, the other one is able to draw on the roots of the other and remain healthy and strong through the worst weather. And I believe that's how God designed us, to be connected with safe, open, loyal friends who are going to stick closer than a brother or sister during the tough times. However, these relationships don't happen by default, only really by design, and they require intentionality and time to forge. But the sacrifice is worth it in the end. So that's one of the biggest things, is making sure that you have people around you that you can talk to, that understand, maybe that have been through something similar, or because even when I was going through the therapy, although it was helpful, but these people never lost a child. They didn't really understand what I was feeling and really what that pain was really like, so I wasn't able to really get the kind of healing that I needed. So there are groups out there, that you can join, that you can, that can help you depending on whatever it is that you can go through. But just, make sure that you're not going through it alone. That is definitely one of the big things, and making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like that you're focusing on community, because it truly is about community and finding and getting involved in one if you don't have one today, and having that. Because I think for a lot of us, man, we do tend to have this lone wolf idea that we'll just handle it on our own. And we may very well do that for a period of time. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to grow and really get into our true masculine strength by being around other men to help guide through. And we may not have the right answer. And so I'm wondering, because you've had the experience of having the loss, and then you've mentioned a couple of times about people like just they have good intentions, but they don't really know what to do. Do you have any words of wisdom for, hey, if you're that person now, what would you recommend for them to be in that support role for one of their brothers?
That's a great question. That is a great question. Because a lot of people ask me, like they'll even say, or text me even say, Phil, my wife just lost her mother. Like, what do I say?
Yeah.
What do I say? What do I do? And a lot of us, we don't know. We don't really know the right words to say. And really, after thinking about this quite a bit, the only thing because there is nothing you can do in that moment. There is no, in those moments where people are in that pain, there's nothing you can say. There's nothing you can do, at least there are some things that you could do to help them, maybe, but not say to them that's going to help them fix it. But in terms of words, like the best thing that I've been able to come up with is something like, I am so sorry for your loss. I know there are no words. Just know that I love you and that I'm here for you. And that's it, really, in terms of what you can say. In terms of what you can do, I know that I needed help with someone even making sure my bills were getting paid, not to pay them for me, not to give me the money, but just be like, let me go online and help you pay your bank account. Did you make sure that the landscaper got paid? Because I was literally out of it.
Sure.
If you live somewhere where it snows, shovel their driveway, bring them dinner. Just things like that. Think about the things that they're not thinking about, because that person is not thinking about the day-to-day aspects of what they should be doing. When you think that they might be, chances are they're probably not feeding themselves. They're not getting outside. They're not, I remember when I went back to my office, and this was months later, I went back to, started to get back to work. And this was probably like even 4 months after. It was the first day back in my office. And thankfully I had a door that I could close, but I was sitting there and I just peed in my pants. Like I didn't even want to get up to go to the bathroom. Like that's how bad it could be for some people. Like they're not that I didn't care. Like I just didn't care, I was in such pain that I was just like, and you had mentioned earlier, that I found my faith and that helped me through. And it totally did. But don't get me wrong. There's still going to be, there was a year good, I'd say a good 18 months of just real deep despair for me. But it wasn't until I heard my son, in one of those moments, I heard my son, and I heard him physically come to me in one of those moments where I was just completely out of it, on the floor crying. And he said, "Get up, Dad. It's okay. I'll see you when you get here." Like I heard him say that. And in that moment, I realized, all right, like it was almost like he was annoyed. It was like, he was like, "All right, Dad, listen, you always told me to live my life with passion, and go out and, don't do anything for money, do what you love, you cried, you've been there for 18 months, get up off the floor already and start living your life. And I'll see you when you get here." And in that moment, I realized, what? Sometimes our grief can really be part of how we choose to honor and respect the ones that we love, despite their physical absence. And it just let me know, my son, and likely anybody out there who's listening, who's lost a loved one, I'd be willing to bet that your loved one would tell you to get up too. Nobody wants to see their loved one lying on the floor in despair and living a life of nothingness while they're somewhere else. That's just my belief. So in that moment, that was a big shift for me to just say, okay, you know what? I'm going to get up. And I'm going to start living my life, and I'm going to, keep my son in mind every single day. I talk to him, and healing doesn't mean forgetting.
No.
It doesn't mean that because we choose to go on and go on with our life, doesn't mean that we're forgetting about that person that we lost.
Yeah.
It's just I looked at it differently. I'm gonna respect my son's wish and stop living the way that I was and start living a different life. And for me, some people have said, well, it sounds like, he gave you permission. But it was more that he showed me I needed to give myself permission. I needed to give, because I was in that, like, why couldn't I save you? And I'm so sorry. And what about this? And all these, other things that I could have, should have done, caught up in all that. And I realized that, I started I used Post-it notes. I wrote little notes to myself on Post-it notes. And I wrote, I give myself permission to heal. And I put them on my desk. I put them in my mirror. I put it in my car. And those were, I called them my permission slips. And those were reminders to me every day that it's okay. It's okay that I don't have to live in this place of despair every single day. It's okay to visit there. It's kind of like, Milwaukee, like no one wants to go there. Sometimes you have to go there maybe for business, but you don't want to stay there, right? Sorry to anybody who's listening from Milwaukee. I don't know. That was the first city that came to mind, but it really does come down to a choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally love that. Love the, I get the same thing. I'm up in Winnipeg, Canada here. So everybody wants to visit, but nobody wants to stay here. Beautiful. It's a beautiful city. It's just the way it is. So listen, you're going through all this transition, but was there any particular person that stood out that helped you, help you through the getting your coping mechanisms put together and helping you really, shift your life? Was there any one individual or piece that really was the catalyst to help you create your change?
I'd really say that it was my son, and hearing him say those words to me, that was the biggest catalyst for me that was the shift that I needed in that moment. It was literally from going, and there was so many times where I'm like, okay, God, like, the whole why me? Why did you let this happen? I was faithful, and while why is a reasonable question to ask, and one that we should ask for a season. Again, it wasn't until I started asking, okay, well, what now? What is it that you want me to be doing from this? What can I learn from this? What kind of lessons? How can I help other people through this? And then it was, just starting to talk about it, literally, instead of just pushing it down, because this was such a major news story. It was, and anybody on the East Coast of Florida will likely, and it's been almost 7 years, but still people would be like, I remember that story. I remember that because it was a really big story on the news and social media. And, I remember even going out, like when I first started getting back out in the world, and I'm like, what is a man who lost his son at sea supposed to look like? Like, how am I supposed to act? Am I supposed to walk around like with my head down and sad? And so which I was doing, but, not as an act, because that's how I truly felt. But once I stopped doing that, people were like, how are you living right now? What are you doing? Like, what did you do to get from where you were to our right now? And just having, I started talking about Perry, and I started, talking to other guys and women, and other people started sharing their story with me. And through that sharing, and through that talking about it, and through that facing it, was really where the healing truly started to happen, instead of just, worrying about, what people might say or think about how I'm supposed to act, instead of just doing what came naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. That makes so much sense to hear you say that. And so that really leads into the next piece. I want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing today. So you offer some different services. Tell us our listeners a little bit about your work and what you do for folks.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I started, because so many people were asking me, how did you do this? Can you help me? And so I started helping people and just talking to them. And I wasn't charging anybody for it. It was just my heart to be able to help other people. I figured, like, here's what I did. I said, here's what I did first. Here's what I did second. I started walking people through some of these things. And then in sharing that, I found people were saying, thank you, Phil. Like what you did and what you shared really helped me get through a hard time. And then I gave a TED talk. Also, I gave a TED talk about my whole experience with grief, and so many people, have written me emails and sent me, letters about how much my talk has helped them and things like that. So I went from, and I'm still working one-on-one with people who are going through a grieving process, who are just really stuck, and can't get past it. But now lately, I've also been helping people, I think, which I'm really excited about, through that post-traumatic growth opportunity, where like, what can I do about it now? Like, do you want to write a book? Do you want to do a TED talk? Like, these are all things where I feel like I can help other people. And, somebody once said something to me that stuck with me, and it was that we're always most powerfully positioned to serve the person that we once were. And so anybody that's been out there and been through something tough, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to be the loss of a child, there are certain steps that you can take. And that's the work that I'm doing now, is helping others really get unstuck from some type of traumatic accident or traumatic event that took place in their life, where they can't stop focusing on it. They can't move forward. And that's the short version.
Well, that's outstanding. And it's great. And I know for sure this is going to create a powerful movement, because it's so needed for folks to be able to have some help with this work, this grief process, because there is no recipe. So there just isn't a recipe card, and everyone needs some guidance, and you're doing that. So of everything that we've spoken about today, and maybe something we haven't yet touched on, what's one takeaway you would want to give our listeners about everything of dealing with grief?
I would say, if there's somebody that's in your life, your wife, your husband, somebody that you love and that you trust, so I'm going to back up for 1 second. I've been remarried for about 4 years now. And my new wife, and on the anniversary of Perry's birthday and on the day he went missing, she'd always ask me, what do you want to do today? What do you want to do? And I always kind of just shut her out, because I think like she doesn't understand my pain. I would go to the coast and just cry my eyes out, talk to Perry. And I never really let her in on any of that. But this past year would have been Perry's 21st birthday. And I decided to do something different. We went to a local restaurant. I took my wife with me. When we toasted Perry. I started sharing stories, and I've shared stories with her before, but it was more, her just sitting there with me. And she did something, she did the thing that I think most people should do if anybody invites you into that space. Is she didn't try to fix it. She didn't try to make it better or anything like that. She just cried with me. She held my hand. She toasted Perry with me. So all that to say is that if there's a person, and that if you've been through something traumatic, and there's somebody that who truly loves you, and has been sending you signals that they want to be there with you on that day that you probably generally spend alone, try something different. Let them in. The right person, let them in, share with them, and see where that gets you. Because I realized that I had been doing both myself and my wife an extreme disservice by trying to go through this alone. And that next morning, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't felt before. Because even when we'd watch movies together and I'd see something that reminded me of Perry, like I'd cry and I'd start wiping my tears away so she couldn't see me that I was crying, trying to be like, But now it's like I feel much more okay with that, So let a couple of people into your pain, the people that that trust you, especially because you can't go through it alone. So if there's anybody out there, I would say try something new.
Oh, I love that. That's a great way. That's a great way to sum up our discussion here today. So I want to thank you, Phil, for spending time with me today. We unpacked, quite a bit of information here on such an important topic. And I know there's so much more we could do and get into. So, but grieving is going to be different for all of us. And the work in this field that you're doing, especially for men, is really desperately needed. And I want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing, my brother. But if people want to get a hold of you and get involved in one of your programs or get some help, how would they go about doing that?
Sure. You can just go to my website. It's Phil Cohen, PhilCohen.com. From there, send me an email. I'd love to hear your story. I have a 30-minute call that I get on. That's I don't charge anything for, just to find out if this is a good fit and see if there's anything I can help you with there. And if you feel like you'd like to continue with me, great. If not, then we'd go from there.
Perfect. I'll make sure I put all that information in the show notes for this.
Okay.
When the podcast goes live, we'll make sure everyone is aware of it, because you're doing some amazing work, Phil. And I just want to say once again, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Alan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is The Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.